The rain in Chicago wasn't falling. It was attacking, a sideways sheet of icing needles that turned the city into a blur of smeared taillights and neon reflections. Sergeant First Class Marcus Thorne stood rigidly under the narrow awning of a downtown hotel, his dress uniform jacket offering little protection from the spray. Every muscle in his body ached with deep, jet-lag fatigue. He'd been traveling for nearly 36 hours straight, from a dusty forward operating base in Kuwait to this, his first night of a long-awaited leave. In his left hand, he held a small, hard-shell case. Inside, nestled against blue velvet, was the Medal of Honor. In 12 hours, he was scheduled to be at the White House to receive it from the president. The citation would read about his actions in Kunduz, how he'd run back into a burning building not once, but 3 times, to pull out his wounded squad members while shrapnel tore through his own leg. Right now, all he felt was tired. He saw the yellow taxi's roof light and raised his free hand. The cab swerved the curb, and Marcus slid into the back seat, the relief of being out of the rain. So profound it was almost spiritual. The driver, a man in his late 50s named Joe with a face like a clenched fist and a faded "Don't tread on me" tattoo on his forearm, didn't turn around. "Where to?" he grunted, his eyes flicking to Marcus in the rear view. Marcus gave the address of a modest hotel in the South Loop, where he'd booked a room to get a solid night's sleep before the ceremony. He leaned his head back against the seat, closed his eyes for just a moment. The cab didn't move. Marcus opened his eyes. Joe was turned in his seat, his gaze sweeping over Marcus's uniform with open suspicion. It was wrinkled from travel, but the insignia was clear. "You a soldier?" Joe asked, his tone accusatory. "Sergeant First Class Thorne," Marcus replied, his voice neutral, the ingrained military courtesy automatic. "That a real uniform?" Joe pressed, his eyes narrowing. "I see guys all the time. Stolen valor. Wearing costumes to get sympathy. Free rides. You got ID?" "Military ID." A cold knot tightened in Marcus's stomach, different from the fatigue. This wasn't curiosity. It was an interrogation. "It's real. I've had a long trip. Can we just go, please?" Joe's lips curled into a sneer. "Yeah, I don't think so. I'm not falling for it. I can spot a fake a mile away. Get out of my cab." Marcus sat stunned. The rain hammered on the roof. "What?" "I'm in uniform. I have my wallet right here." "I said, get out." Joe barked, his voice rising to a shout. He jabbed a thick finger toward the door. "I don't drive fakes. I don't drive liars. Out! Now!" The raw, unwarranted hostility was a physical blow. For a moment, Marcus wasn't a decorated soldier. He was just a black man being told he didn't belong. The discipline instilled in him over 15 years of service was the only thing that kept his fury in check. He slowly reached for the door handle. As he did, the small, hard shell case on the seat beside him slipped and fell to the floor of the cab. It popped open. Joe's eyes, drawn by the sound, dropped to the floor. There, gleaming against the blue velvet under the cab's dim interior light, was a distinctive, pale blue ribbon and 5-pointed star of the Medal of Honor. Time froze. Joe's face underwent a terrifying transformation. The belligerent sneer melted away, replaced first by confusion, then by dawning, horrific recognition. His eyes bulged. His mouth fell open. He knew what it was. Every American knew what it was. Marcus didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He leaned down, picked up the case, closed it with a soft, definitive click, and opened the cab door. The roar of the rain in the city rushed in. He stepped back out into the deluge, the icy water instantly soaking through his uniform. He turned and looked at Joe through the open door, his expression not of anger, but of profound, weary disappointment. "It's real, too," Marcus said, his voice quiet but cutting through the storm. He slammed the door shut. Through the water-streaked window, he saw Joe still sitting there, frozen, a statue of shame and shock, the truth of his prejudice staring back at him in the form of the nation's highest military honor. Marcus turned and started walking, the case clutched tightly in his hand. The cold and the wet were nothing compared to the coldness settling in his heart. Marcus finally found another cab, a rideshare driven by a young woman, who didn't give his uniform a second glance. He made it to his hotel, the hot shower doing little to wash away the chill of the encounter. He thought about just going to sleep, about trying to forget it. But the image of Joe's horrified face was seared into his mind. That look wasn't just about the medal. It was about the catastrophic collapse of a bigoted worldview. It was the expression of a man realizing he had just thrown the American ideal he claimed to cherish out into a storm. Meanwhile, Joe sat in his cab, parked illegally, unable to drive. His hands were shaking on the wheel. The gleaming medal replayed in his mind on a loop, superimposed over his own ugly words. Asterisk, get out of my cab. I don't drive fakes. Asterisk, he felt nauseous. He, a man who plastered patriotic stickers on his bumper and flew a flag on his porch every July 4th, had just denied service to a bona fide war hero, a Medal of Honor recipient. The hypocrisy was a poison in his veins. He drove home in a daze. That night, he couldn't sleep. The shame was a physical weight on his chest. The next morning, he saw the news. The president was awarding the Medal of Honor to Sergeant First Class Marcus Thorne for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his own life. There, on every major network, was a photo of the soldier he had thrown out of his cab. Joe felt the world tilt. He had to do something. He had to apologize. It was the only way to lift the weight. He called the taxi company's owner, a man named Arturo, and confessed everything in a rambling, desperate monologue. Arturo was silent for a long time after Joe finished. Joe, do you have any idea what you've done? This isn't just about you. This is on the whole company. I know, Joe pleaded. Just get me his number. An email. Something. I have to make this right. I'll see what I can do, Arturo said, his voice heavy. But Joe, brace yourself. Arturo managed to get a message to the Army Public Affairs officer handling Sergeant Thorne. The request for contact was passed to Marcus just after the White House ceremony. He stood in his pristine dress blues, the weight of the new medal heavy on his chest, reading the email on his phone. The taxi driver, Joseph Petrovich, is desperate to speak with you and offers most sincere apologies. Marcus showed the email to his mentor, Colonel Jane Miller, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had guided his career. What do you want to do, Sergeant? She asked. Marcus sighed. I don't know, ma'am. Part of me never wants to see him again. Another part, I don't know. He saw the medal. He knows what he did. The Army takes care of its own, Marcus, the colonel said. But this is your call. If you want to meet him, I'll be there. If you want to ignore him, we release a statement and this all goes away. Marcus thought about the walk in the rain. He thought about the principle of the thing. It wasn't just about him. Set up a meeting, he said finally, but on my terms, at the USO Center. Neutral ground. The meeting was arranged for 2 days later. The media, having caught a whispered story involving the new Medal of Honor recipient and a racist incident, was already circling. News vans were parked outside the downtown USO Center. Inside a quiet room, Marcus sat at a table, still in his dress uniform, the Medal of Honor prominent on his chest. Colonel Miller stood nearby, a silent pillar of support. Joe was led in by Arturo. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. His face was pale, and he couldn't bring himself to look directly at Marcus, his eyes instead fixated on the medal. Sergeant Thorne, I don't have the words. Joe began, his voice cracking. What I did was unforgivable. I am so ashamed. I'm so sorry. He was on the verge of tears. Marcus watched him, his expression unreadable. Why, Joe? He asked, his voice calm but firm. Why did you do it? Before you saw the medal. Why did you look at me and see a liar? Joe flinched as if struck. The question demanded a truth he wasn't prepared to give. I've been scammed before at guys in uniforms. That's not it, Marcus interrupted, not unkindly, but with the force of truth. You saw a black man in a uniform, and your first thought wasn't soldier. It was thief. You didn't question my service. You questioned my right to wear it. The medal didn't change what you did. It just made it impossible for you to ignore. Joe stood there, utterly exposed. There was no defense. The patriotic facade had been stripped away, revealing the ugly prejudice beneath. He had no words left, only a silent, weeping shame. Colonel Miller stepped forward. "Mr. Petrovich, the Army appreciates your apology, but Sergeant Thorne's experience is not an isolated one. This is about a systemic lack of respect for the service and sacrifice of soldiers of color." She placed a folder on the table. "Therefore, in lieu of any personal legal action, which Sergeant Thorne has declined to pursue, you request that you and your company partner with the USO to fund and participate in a new initiative. It's called Project Homefront Respect. It's a citywide training program for all transportation workers, taxi, rideshare, bus, on how to properly identify and respect military personnel, and more importantly, to confront the unconscious biases that lead to incidents like this." It was a sentence that fit the crime. Not jail, not a fine, but education. A chance to actually fix the broken thing inside him and his industry. Joe looked from the colonel to Marcus, who gave a single, slow nod. It was a path to redemption. A long, hard road, but a path. "Yes," Joe whispered, tears finally streaming down his face. "Anything. I'll do anything." As Joe and Arturo left, Colonel Miller turned to Marcus. "That was a very soldierly thing to do, Sergeant, turning your personal injustice into a force for systemic change." Marcus finally allowed himself a small, tired smile, touching the metal on his chest. "We leave no one behind, ma'am. Sometimes that includes the ones who are lost in their own prejudice." 6 months later, the Project Homefront Respect initiative was launching at the main USO Center. The room was filled with taxi and rideshare drivers, transit authority officials, and local media. Colonel Miller was at the podium, but she wasn't the main speaker. Joe Petrovich stood off to the side, looking older and quieter, but cleaner somehow. The perpetual scowl was gone, replaced by a look of thoughtful gravity. He had been the first to sign up for the training, and had become its most unlikely evangelist, speaking to driver groups with a raw, painful honesty about his own failings. The key speaker was Sergeant First Class Marcus Thorne. Marcus walked to the podium, not in his dress blues, but in a sharp business suit. His leg had finally healed enough for him to medically retire, and he was starting a new career advocating for veterans. The room fell silent. 6 months ago, Marcus began, "I returned from my last deployment. I was tired. I was hurt. And I was proud of my service, proud of my team. The first person to welcome me home was a taxi driver who looked at my uniform and saw a costume. He saw a lie. He paused, letting the memory hang in the air. He was wrong. But what I've learned since is that his prejudice wasn't born in a vacuum. It's fed by a culture that often celebrates the idea of the military more than it understands the people in it. We put soldiers on a pedestal, but we don't always see them as individuals, with all the diversity and complexity that entails." His gaze swept the room, landing on the drivers. This program isn't about teaching you to spot a fake ID. It's about teaching you to see the person. The soldier who might be tired, scared, or just trying to get home. The veteran who might be struggling to find his place. It's about extending the same respect and dignity you'd offer anyone, not because of what they're wearing, but because of who they are. It was a powerful, moving speech. When he finished, the room erupted in applause. As the event wound down, Joe finally found the courage to approach Marcus. "Sergeant," Joe said, his voice firm now, clear, "I've taken the training. All of it. I've learned a lot. About the Army. And about myself." Marcus nodded. "I've heard. Colonel Miller says you've been doing good work." "I'm trying," Joe said. He hesitated, then stood up straight, his shoulders back. He looked Marcus directly in the eye for the first time since that night in the rain. And then, slowly, deliberately, Joe Petrovich, a 58-year-old taxi driver from Chicago, raised his hand in a crisp, formal salute. It wasn't perfect. The angle of his wrist was slightly off, but the intention was flawless. It was a gesture of respect, of apology, of recognition. It was a signal that he finally saw Marcus Thorne not for his skin, but for his service. Not for the medal, but for the man. Marcus, the retired Sergeant First Class, instinctively straightened his own posture. He looked at the man before him. saw the struggle and the effort in his eyes, and saw not an enemy, but a fellow American who had found his way back. He returned the salute. It lasted only a few seconds, but in that silent exchange, an entire journey of pain, prejudice, justice, and redemption was completed. The past wasn't erased, but it was healed. As they lowered their hands, Joe finally smiled, a real, genuine smile. "Welcome home, Sergeant." "Thank you, Joe," Marcus replied, his own smile reaching his eyes. "It's good to be home." Thanks for listening to the story. Subscribe and share to join our fight for social justice. Kick out discrimination and prejudice. Stay tuned for what's next. The end.